Okay, say hi. Say hi, everyone.
Hello.
So we have some guests from China, and this particular lady has a question, and that question was why is
there's so big difference that in maybe in Israel, religion is very important thing, but in China it's not.
so why is religion so important in Israel? And I asked this nice lady here. I asked her what was important in China, and she said that it's that what's important in China is
Have a physically better life.
a physically better life. It could be that things in Israel I mean, I don't know how to answer this exactly like the way I was going, but the main point is that existence, like existing as a human being with all of your needs, is to us is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, on a Darwinian level, it does, meaning like the animal kingdom, like existence, survival is very important. And for the plant kingdom, survival is very important. And for the human kingdom, survival is important. But it's but once you're surviving, so then it leads to more questions of, well, what are we surviving for? And what am I doing here? And where'd I come from? And very important questions come up that are answered by Judaism. Very important questions come up that Judaism answers. And not only Judaism, but I think all the religions of the world are, in some level or another, they're out to answer life's questions and to make sense of our world, to make sense of and meaning out of life. But it's true that people don't seem to care much about this when they're not surviving so well. Meaning in populations that aren't doing so hot, you're not going to find religion as high a priority. They may have religion, but it won't be as high a priority as putting food on the table. And but once food's on the table, so then the questions of meaning of life is, paramount. That's really important, because I want to know why. Why am I doing this? What's the point? Where did we come from? Is there a point to creation? Is there meaning beyond survival? And the answer is that there is, and on a very basic level, there's the desire to be good, to be a good person. But how can you be a good person? What was called a good person in the times of the Greeks, today you'd be put in jail for much of that stuff, whether it be pedophilia or whether it be infanticide. You'd be put in jail for what was called a good person in those days. So you start to realize what it is to be good is relative. And religions tend to define good. They tend to say this is what's good and this is what's not good, but they generally can't handle details. They just be a good person. But they keep it real vague on what it is to be a good person, and I understand that, because how are you supposed to really know? And then there's Westerners generally, not Christians generally, separate church and state in the countries where Christianity exists. So being a good person has nothing to do with Christianity, meaning they may talk about it with platitudes, but it's not enforced by the state. Whatever Christianity would say is good is not going to be enforceable. So therefore it doesn't mean anything really, because it has no weight. There's no teeth in what they call good, because it's separate from the state. And then how does the state decide what's good? And that's also becomes quite relative depending on the state you're in. As I mentioned already, the Greek state had things that our states today would consider illegal and be punishable maybe even by death, or certainly life imprisonment. And so it all is quite relative. It's really it's difficult to know what it is to be good, but beyond survival is being good. Now, what's interesting is every human being was born with a conscience. Each one of you has inside of you a desire to be good. We all really want to be good. And there is a natural morality that happens in the world just by the mere pushback, meaning, let's say you don't believe there's anything called good, but you know, it's kind of kept nebulous. You know, you have inside of you there's good and bad, but you don't know on any like absolute level. It's purely relative. So maybe you'd think stealing is okay. Okay, but when you come back home with a broken nose and 2 black eyes and 3 broken ribs, so you suddenly morality kicks in on a natural level because there's pushback for one who breaks their natural values. When you there's something called natural law, like meaning natural morality. I'm sorry, there's natural morality, and that is that the pushback of just your relativist morality bumping into other people's relativist morality, and you may not think stealing's bad, but the guy you stole from certainly punished you, and now you're hurting for certain, and maybe that develops wrong and right is, you know, what pushes people over the edge to get violent. Maybe that's morality, and that for most of history has kind of been the morality, and that's basically been it. But we have not yet discussed Judaism at all. Yeah, you got a question back there?
Yeah, there's some around, you're talking about like there'll be pushback from the society. You have some societies where they'll...
Just don't press anything up.
There are,
That's how you flip the camera.
Yeah, you were saying?
yeah, there were some societies where it was okay to steal. So then there, you're not going to have a pushback for that. And that doesn't, that won't necessarily make it the right thing to do.
Sorry, I lost touch with that. Are you sending messages over here?
No, she's taking notes.
No, I'm taking notes. I promise. No.
I believe you.
This is perfectly
I
true.
would not think you're just going to sit there and lie. I totally believe you. I just got distracted.
Okay.
Has this been on you guys this whole time?
No.
No, it's been on you.
No, she switched it back.
Oh, okay. I was
It's
just
still
afraid
back
she was touching the...
No, if you
someone
double
shut
tap
it
it,
off last
I would
time.
never.
If you
Okay,
double
we're good.
tap, it flips.
We're on you.
Flip the camera.
Are you serious? You can double tap
Yeah,
the
so
screen?
that's why she double tapped on the
Yeah,
side.
that's how you do it.
That-
How'd you know
I
that?
have an iPhone too, remember?
Yeah, I stole your power cord. That's...
It's
Oh my
fine.
gosh, that's so cool. All this time we've been trying to hit that little button. Even I can double tap.
You know we're live on camera right now.
Okay, go ahead.
All across the world.
I'm also taking
Wait,
notes, by the way.
question,
I'm not texting, I'm taking notes.
You were saying there'd be like natural pushbacks. Like you'll go and steal, someone will beat you up, and then you realize stealing's the wrong thing to do. What about a society where the right thing to do is steal? You're not going to have that natural pushback. Where's your morality?
The
come from
novel.
More famous.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying before, and that was the that it really becomes quite random. So yeah, if there's
Do it again.
did I do it? Double click it.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, let her. There you go.
I did not click hard enough, maybe. Wow, I learned a new trick. I'm so happy. Yeah.
I just want to comment on this young lady's question about Chinese versus Israel, which I'll refer Israel to as Jews. There are 100 Chinese for every Jewish person in the world.
Yeah, you
So
did.
if Jews did not take their religion seriously, as Chinese are not as religious, the Jews would become extinct because we don't have the critical mass. That's what would happen. So Jews need to develop our religion and study our religion and stay more religious just to remain a people and remain viable.
I would never have thought of that. But it's for sure an interesting answer as how important it is to us is that, you know, it's interesting. Israel altogether is kind of interesting because what really does bind us? We have a land that's not our own because Torah is very clear it's God's land. Okay, this is God's land. You look at the very first commentary in the Torah, it makes it real clear. This is not our land. And it is God's land, and God is in charge of the land. And he gave it to the 7 Canaanite nations, took it from them, gave it to us. Took it from us, it became a desert wasteland. Some nomadic Arabs lived here for a long time, and that's, of course, today become the Palestinian claim, is the nomadic Arabs somehow translate into the Palestinians, which by the way, I buy their narrative personally. I actually have nothing against their narrative at all, but certainly they were hardly a nation. They were just, I'm a mountain biker, so I get to meet Arabs hanging around the mountains, in villages and stuff, and they're not a nation. They're just people hanging around areas of the mountains, and which is what that's what was here. If you check out the populations and where the populations were, you'd see there was no such thing as a Palestinian people until they decided they were a Palestinian people, which was well after the State of Israel was formed. And those people, people who lost their homes or whatever and lost their neighborhoods. There's whole neighborhoods that were taken by the Israelis. So that's a very legitimate claim. But it's the same claim that the Native American Indians have, and the same claim that the South Americans have in, Rio de Janeiro, who had a tribe living there, and it's the claim of every country, because almost every country in the world has been taken over by people stronger than them, and that's just the name of the game of every country's population. It's just that in this case it happens to be the Jews, and when it's the Jews, you get ready for the double standard, and it's good that we have a double standard, that the world doesn't want to accept the conquering of the land of Israel in 1948 and 67. It's good that the world doesn't want to accept that, because back to my original point is we're not supposed to be nationalists, because it really is not our land. This is not ours, it's God's land. And this is why you'll notice we're the only country in the world, we're the only nation in the world that's not from their land. You meet a guy from Spain, he's a Spanish guy, he's from Spain, an Englishman is from England, a African is from Africa, and a South African is from South Africa. But a Jew is from Egypt. We're from Egypt. We were born in another land. It's called Goy Mikerev Goy, a nation from within a nation. And that's very destabilizing. Not to mention we were born in slavery, ultimately. Transgenerational slavery means you think you're free when you're enslaved. Because if you enslave a free man, that's slavery. But when you enslave people who become a nation, that's a slave nation. So they don't know they're free. And a good example of that is how long it's taken the Africans of America, who were enslaved by the Americans, emancipated by Abe Lincoln, I don't know how long ago, and their rights fought for by Martin Luther King, whom I'm named after. I was born 3 days after he was assassinated, and my English name is John Martin, named after Martin Luther King. And this rabbi is named after a black minister. This is my universal appeal, I'm just born to reach everybody. That's enough of a hook right there, right? So, anyway, but yet they're still fighting to break the stigma in the eyes of others, and to break their own chains. Years, decades later, still fighting that fight. Jewish people, we came out of the Holocaust. The Jews came out of the Holocaust stick figures, looked like Ethiopians with the swollen, the distended belly and the swollen skulls and the toothpick arms and flies everywhere, and they were left for dead until the Allies came and liberated the camps. But check out those same people 5 years later. I mean, once they could get some weight on their bodies and hold down some food, they were like running the financial district of Manhattan. They were already major lobbyists in the U.S. government. They had built a country in Israel from scratch, like just boom. To become the one of the third most powerful, the fourth most powerful country in the world, behind the U.S., Russia, China, is Israel ultimately to this day, and the second biggest startup country, high-tech startup country in the world, only the U.S. And we really, if you play with the numbers, we'd be way bigger than the U.S. if you start looking at the actual swath of land we're talking about, and you know, and the tiny population we have here. You know, we're way beyond them in high tech, and so it's just incredible. And all of this happened immediately after the war, meaning we were in slave labor torture chambers, in extreme torture, and walk out of there and rise straight out. And that's our whole nation is we're born in slavery and rose to greatness because we were taught at Sinai. Right after our slavery, we went 40 days later, after the leaving of Egypt, 40 days later, we found out that many things. One is that there's a God. Two is that we have a soul, which means that as much as you can beat my body, you can never beat my soul. You know, how many souls were killed in the Holocaust?
None.
0. How do you kill a soul? Can't kill a soul. It's eternal. And it's beautiful, and it's holy, and it's clean, and it's pure, and it's sourced in the Creator Himself. So, which means you have a part of the Creator Himself inside of you, and that's your soul. And so, okay, yeah, it was a rough in the Holocaust, but we're standing up now. We're going to build our country, or we're going to build ourselves. We're going to build our Judaism back up. Because we have something way beyond the physical veneer of what we may have gone through at any given time. Judaism's, the meaning that comes from Judaism, and the reason why Judaism is so important is because it's not a meaning that's man-made. This is not a man-made deal here. This is it comes from a prophetic experience, so it's a God-given thing. Now, I know every religion in the world claims its source is God, but, I mean, you don't have to go beyond his story, meaning the history department of the university, to know that it's not, that they're man-made things. Take any religion in the world, it's man-made. The Hindus got their mysticism. It's mostly a mystical tradition. They got their mysticism right at the time that Abraham sent his 6 sons eastward. That's why the highest caste of Hindus are called Brahmins, like Abraham. They're called Brahmins. And check out the scholarship. I'm just going off secular scholarship, that they believe it came from the west, meaning west of the Euphrates, which is Israel, at exactly the time that Abraham sent his children, his 6 kids that he had with Keturah, which means incense. He married a girl named Incense, had 6 kids. The Torah lists all their kids and the grandkids, lists the names, which all are the names of the Hindu books. The books of Hinduism are the names of these kids. And they took these, and it says that God gave all he had to Isaac, but to the 6 children, he gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac eastward to the land of the east. And so if he gave all he had to Isaac, what are the gifts? And the answer is the gifts were the mystical tradition. And that's why you'll notice that when a Kabbalist sits with someone who's a master of Hinduism or Buddhism, that they have a lot to talk about. But when you have a rabbi sit with a Christian, they run out of what to talk about within 10 minutes. And when a rabbi sits with a Muslim, they run out to talk about in 5 minutes. Because there's not much to talk about. But you put a Kabbalistic rabbi with a Hindu mystic, they can talk for years. Literally years. In fact, I was just WhatsApping with a rabbi in India right now who's already been talking for a few months with people over there. And he's got another month coming, apparently, before he comes back. And there's tremendous exchange there. In a way, you could say that the Eastern religions are like the internals of Judaism, and the Western religions are the externals of Judaism. Because think about it, Christianity started right at the end of the temple's period. So Christianity is a very big takeoff on Temple Judaism. It's a centralized prayer, just like we used to have centralized prayer, the temple. They have the church. It's a priesthood. We had a priesthood. So it's a clergy setup and how it works. It's also funky outfits on the priests. incense going around. They have everything's just they don't do sacrifices because they say JC was the sacrifice, and that's like they're basically, it's just a takeoff on, it's the externals of temple Judaism without any of the internals, because how would they know anything about the internals? The internals has to do with the temple service, and there you need the oral law, which Christians have no clue about the oral law. And then what happened 700 years later is Islam took off. When did Islam take off? Well, who were the people in the region that were into God? Jews. What were Jews? Jews were synagogue Jews, not temple Jews, synagogue Jews, which was non-centralized, meaning you pray anywhere you want. And haven't we all seen Muslims praying everywhere and Jews praying everywhere? You know, you see a Jew, he's a little embarrassed to pray anywhere. So they used to have phone booths. So the Jews used to go in phone booths and hold the phone and pray, you know, in the afternoon service. You'd see Jews praying in phone booths, pretending they're on a phone call. You know, Muslims aren't afraid at all to pray in front of people, but Jews would get a little embarrassed, so they pray in a phone booth. And of course, there's the famous story of while he's praying, some jerk is banging on the glass, because there were like these little glass boxes. It's called phone booths. Do you remember those? Phone booth. And anyway, there was some jerks banging on the door the whole time. So the Jew's like trying to pray, you know, and he's banging, he's praying, and finally he opens the door. He finishes his prayers, backs out, hangs up the phone, opens the door, and who was it? It was the phone repair service. He said, "This phone hasn't worked in 3 weeks."
That's talking to God. You know the joke about Bibi, U.S. president with the red phone?
You'll tell me after, but I have heard it, yeah. So anyway, so Islam, they pray, it's non-centralized prayer. There's no priesthood or clergy. Everyone's a practitioner. It's a also everyone's a practitioner, meaning everyone's got these daily prayers they're doing. And and they have mosques like synagogues, a place you can go congregate if you want. So Christianity is the takeoff on temple Judaism, and Islam's the takeoff on synagogue Judaism. But the actual inner guts of the Judaism is the gifts that Abraham gave those 6 kids. And he obviously gave them to Isaac, because we have all those traditions as well. And that's why it's interesting to speak to Easterners. Speaking of people of Eastern tradition, that's interesting. And you should know, by the way, even though the Eastern people, the people from India and other Far East countries and Southeast Asia that are into these things, that are like, for example, Bali's a Hindu country. When all these countries, you know, we consider them steeped in idolatry. And the reason they're steeped in idolatry is because they're in the metaphysical world. You know, this is called the physical world. Like, this stuff is physical, but it's being beamed down from another realm, which is a really complex realm called the metaphysical. And in the metaphysical world, there are, just turning off the backlight. In the metaphysical realm, there are entities, and those entities have very specific addresses, and they're in charge of things. Those entities, meaning even the black in my sweater. First of all, the sweater itself has entities that are creating the sweater, but the black color, this was dyed wool, and even the dye has entities that are in charge of black. There's entities in charge of brown, blue, orange, red, and everything else. These are all entities, and the whole metaphysical world is filled with those entities. And the gifts that Abraham's kids gave the East was all the science behind those entities. It was all the real details, the actual precise details. And what happened was, well, those entities seem to have power if you are not from a Torah background. Meaning, we're from a Torah background. So, like, let's say, I don't know, anyone here willing to get picked on? I'll pick on Nati back there. That's Nati's from Mexico. Okay? Guatemala, sorry. So, same thing. just took these New York businessmen who like have, a lot of Mexicans working for them in New York. So I took them to Costa Rica. Costa Ricans are not Mexicans, not even a little. They're a very proud Central American country. And anyway, but the businessmen they kept by accident saying like, that he was talking to this Mexican guy, and I'm like, we haven't met any Mexican guys here. He's like, oh, Costa Rican. It's so U.S. to consider anyone who speaks Spanish Mexican. Let meet a guy from Chile and ask him if he knows how to make burritos or something. Yeah, so Nati, if I had the ability to introduce you to those entities, and you saw some of those entities to the point where your body went into convulsions, and you started throwing up because you just weren't ready to deal with that, you'd freak out totally. And then when we brought you back from having met that entity, would you say you met God, or you met an entity that God has in place? He's put it in place. Right, because you're from the Sinaitic tradition. You're from the Sinai people. And the people who experience Sinai aren't going to confuse this thing. You understand? We just wouldn't confuse it. If you, what's your name? What? Jason? Jason, and what's your Chinese name? Liang Chungche. So Liang Chungche, if you saw this entity that blew you away entirely in its power, to the point where you're like shaking and you're like throwing up, your body's just like, and then I brought you back, would you say you met God? Yes. For sure. He's smiling and nodding. You met God. And now you understand Hinduism. That's all. And you know what? How can you blame them? They didn't have a prophetic experience at Sinai. It's not in their tradition. And our guests here from China your nation, the Chinese nation, was not at Mount Sinai. It was the Jewish people left Egypt, went to this mountain and had this insane, THX surround sound, Omnimax 3D LSD blow-away moment that's never happened in the history of the world except for then. Never happened before, never happened after. You could even say that the three biggest moments in all of creation are creation, like the actual creation of the world. Apparently, there's going to be an end to it all. There's like an end game, which in Judaism says we'll be at 6,000 years. Right now we're at 5779, so it's 221 years from now, which is like so close, but too far. And meaning for us, we can only discuss it, but I can imagine our great-great-great-grandkids are going to be,
It's within the 250 years.
Yeah. So, anyway, so there's a beginning, there's an end. And by the way, most traditions in the world believe in an end game. Like almost every tradition says there's going to be some kind of end. So what's the middle? The middle is the revelation at Mount Sinai. Now, if you think it's ethnocentric that only the Jews got to have that revelation, because it sounds a little ethnocentric, for us to walk around and say, yeah, we had this revelation, you didn't. And for us to think there's Jews and Gentiles. I mean, it's the funniest thing that we even use the term Gentiles. We believe there's Jews and Gentiles. Jews were at Sinai, Gentiles weren't. But it's a funny thing to say because, for example, I was just teaching some Japanese businessmen yesterday, and they didn't know the term Gentile, and they thought it was really funny that we think there's Jews and Gentiles because we make up 14 million people, whereas the Gentiles make up between 7 and 8 billion people. So, it'd be like they found a little village on an island somewhere, and you meet these little islanders there, and they're like, yeah, there's us, and then there's Gentiles. You're like, what are you people crazy? Like, the margin of error, when they take the census in China, when they count the amount of Chinese people in the world, the margin of error is like 80 million. And you know how many Jews there are in the world? You know how many Jews there are in the world? How many would you guess? How many Jews would you say? Or do you already know? If you
50 million.
Oh, you already know.
Yeah.
Did you know, Elsa? Did you know how many Jews there were? What would you have guessed? How many Jews? If there's 7 billion people, how many Jews would you have guessed, Jason? I was recently in a sports bar, and I was asking everybody in the sports bar once I had had too many beers, and I was in Seattle in the airport, and they had a sports bar in the business lounge. So I was asking everybody, the least number that someone guessed was 1 billion. It was 1 billion. Everyone figured there's, it's got to be at least 1 billion Jews. If you think of our representation on the world stage, it should be commensurate with our population. You'd think it would be anyway, but it's not. It's back on. So.
Do you want it to the other side or to?
Anyway, Wait, 1 second. I'm still answering your question. This is the longest answer to one question of why is religion important in Israel. Where was I at? Revelation.
14 million Jews.
Anyway, the bottom line is that we're going with a revealed experience that was revealed by the Creator himself. So whether we think religion's important or not, it is. Because if the Creator of the universe gave the law of what is called good, remember what we said before. You can survive, but once you're surviving, you have a question of like, well, what would it be to be good? Because every person's built with a moral voice in their head. And so now that I know I want to be good, well, how can I be good? So, and that's up to a lot of debate, what's called good. But Judaism doesn't offer a lot of debate there because the Torah gives us what's called good. And that's from the actual maker of the system. What's called good comes from the actual creator of the creation. We know that because we had a prophetic experience at Sinai where what's called good was given. It's called the Torah. And the Torah is what's called good. Now, I know you get all these intellectuals on the dark web who love to poke at the Torah and say, well, that's no source of morality. It's got slavery there and death penalties for homosexuality and that certainly can't be called that can't be the criteria. They'll say this all the time, and these are smart people. These are smart people saying this. You got your Sam Harris types saying this, and then sadly, Ben Shapiro, who thank God goes in a kippah full time, which is I think amazing. That's so cool. He goes in kippah full time, but I think he spent more time in study of politics and less time in yeshiva. But he doesn't know how to answer these questions either. And so our only chance of a spokesman on the intellectual dark web is Ben Shapiro, which is not going so hot. And then there's, of course, Jordan Peterson, who's doesn't know his ass from his elbow when it comes to Torah, but loves commenting on it. And I have to tell you, I love his commentaries on it. I love him because when a genius puts his mind to something that he believes is important, he at least believes the Bible's important. When a genius puts his mind to it, and most geniuses put their mind to it, they're there to destroy it. But he's actually there to show us what difference it's made in the world. And so I enjoy that very much. But again, he doesn't know what in the world he's talking about when it comes to that. And the funniest thing is that you put all these guys, put Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, Richard Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, and all the other intellectuals on the web today. You put them in front of the greatest rabbi in Israel. First of all, the greatest rabbi in Israel would be too busy to meet with them. It'd be easier to get onto the Joe Rogan show than to meet with one of these rabbis who's they're just busy. They're like the whole entire nation is being held in suspense by them on what they're going to be dealing with in the very important decisions that need to get made for our nation. And they wouldn't give them the time of day. Now, let's just say the rabbis did give them the time of day. They said, you know what? We're going to sit with the intellectual dark web stars. We're going to have Rav Chaim Kanievsky sit with the dark web stars. Except we got another problem now. Let's just say they all spoke Hebrew, or they all spoke English, which would be Chaim Kanievsky's job to learn English. But let's just say they all spoke the same language. What's the other issue? They have zero context to have an intellectual discussion with him. They would have to study Torah for, I guess, with brains like theirs, they would probably need 10 years of Torah before they can have an actual mature conversation with him. I mean, you can't even have the conversation. And these guys today consider themselves in charge of these subjects, which is an embarrassment. And I tell you, I love watching them. I'm crazy about the intellectual dark web. But as soon as the word Bible comes out, here goes another botched job by someone who the whole world's listening to and doesn't know klum, doesn't know nothing. That's klum means nothing. Doesn't know anything about how to handle this subject. So, of course, slavery, the Torah mentions slavery, so obviously the Torah is wrong, and death penalties, etc. Stoning, like people get stoned to death. But like, our Torah comes with oral tradition. You can't read it at face value. Do you think our Torah thinks slavery is good? Not at all. And what is it? What are all the laws around slavery in the Torah? They're how to treat a slave if you wind up with one. And if you'd be willing to free him, that'd be even better. But you can't force a man who owns the handiwork of another man in a world of slave trade in those days. You can't force him to free a slave. He's bought him for $100,000, and go tell him to free him. Like, no, thank you. Oh, I'll be happy to free him. Hand me $100,000. You free him, Mr. Freedom Fighter. It was part of the trade in those days. I mean, they work a lot better than horses, man. People are amazing workers. They can do great, great, great things. And in the days where you could own a human being, which we believe is bad, but in the days where people did own human beings, you can't just tell someone he's got to free a slave. But you know what? The Torah anyway makes you free the slaves on the 50th year. So, meaning if someone bought a slave, he only pays whatever years are left. So let's say someone bought a slave on the 40th year. He's not going to pay what he'd pay on the 30th year because he's only getting half the time. Because on the 50th year, he must set him free. Judaism's about freedom. It's not about slavery. And the whole point of the coming out of Egypt is leaving slavery. And when it comes to death penalties, well, then you need more oral law. Because if you want to say that death penalties are violent, yes, they're violent. What are they set up for? Why does the Torah keep mentioning death? For example, desecrating the Sabbath is a death penalty. Why? No one gets a death penalty for breaking the Sabbath. For desecrating Shabbos, there's no death penalty, but the Torah says there is. Yeah, but we have an oral tradition. The written law does not qualify itself. It requires oral tradition. And one of the best examples, in case you just think I'm making that up, best example is that every single commandment in there is not explained. Not one of them. Not one of them. The Torah doesn't tell you. We have to wear these black boxes. The pair I wore this morning cost $1,900. All the details involved in there, but not one of them is described in the Torah. What am I spending $1,900 for to wear black boxes when the Torah itself doesn't define it? Well, the answer is that the oral tradition does, and I bet my $1,900 that our rabbis got it right when they explain what they are. I'm wearing this cosmic dental floss here. Yeah, I'm wearing the tzitzis. If one of these got cut off my garment, and so now I have a 4-corner garment with 3 instead of 4, yeah, I'm taking it off because I'm not going to walk. I'm not moving till this thing's off of me because the Torah says if you're going to walk in a 4-corner garment, as people used to go in wraps in the old days, you have to put fringes. But the Torah just says put fringes on your 4-corner garment. It doesn't say what. It doesn't say 8 strings. It doesn't say 5 knots. It doesn't say all these little Kabbalistic wraps over here, these little detailed things. Doesn't say anything about it. Doesn't say anything about how to keep Shabbos. So the same Torah that says you get killed for desecrating Shabbos didn't say how to keep Shabbos. Doesn't say anything. Nothing. Just says don't do malacha and then goes on to not describe what the word malacha means. So it has to be that the entire written Torah, the entire written book of the Torah cannot be discussed by anyone who doesn't understand the oral Torah. And just to go one more step on death penalties, if you open up the tractate called Sanhedrin, which goes through the court system, explains how you set up a court system, it turns out that it's impossible to mete out a death penalty. You can't even do it if you wanted to. You can't mete it out. Everywhere you turn, we will dismiss the case. We don't kill people for that. Another interesting thing, we don't have jails. Israel didn't have jails. When someone did something wrong, they were sent to a Levitical city. And they went and hung out with the holiest people. You don't put a bunch of creeps in the same place. All that does is add creepiness to your country. If you want to reform a person, you put them with the holiest, scholarliest people, which was the Kohanim. So the priesthood had cities, and that's where people went if they were in trouble. So then you may ask, well, why is there a death penalty in the Torah if there's no death penalty ever meted out? If no one ever gets the death penalty, so what's it doing in the Torah? Why do we have a death penalty in the Torah? And the answer is to let you know where God means it. That's where God means it. Meaning it'd be better you weren't born than to desecrate Shabbos. What? I mean, that's kind of extreme. Well, you mean like me texting on Shabbos is such a big deal, you know? Like I shouldn't have been born? And the Torah says, yeah, you shouldn't have been born. You're better off dead. Better off dead than breaking Shabbos. That's weird, Rabbi. That sounds a little extreme. And the answer is, it's not extreme. We have no idea what the Shabbos is. God's trying to tell us, like, if you had any idea what Shabbos was, you would wish you'd never been born if you didn't feel strong enough to keep it. Something about testifying that this world was created, and not just on its own, but actually it's a created world. That we testify that God created the world by, just like God refrained from creating new things on Shabbos, we don't create new things on Shabbos. If it's off, keep it off. If it's on, keep it on. No new things. If it's raw, keep it raw. Don't cook it on Shabbos. Keep things as they are, one day a week. And that testifies that God created the world. And when God adds death penalty to that, all he's saying is that this is the point. The fact that you can eat, drink, and somehow pay your bills is not the point. That's not the point of life. You know, and my apologies to the, over 1 billion people in China who think that's the point of life. But it is not the point of life, and it's better to die than live that way. Because, no offense, obviously, everyone in China should be well, but the Torah says it's better to die than live with that alone. Because there's got to be something meaningful for our creation other than just being able to feed yourself or procreate, which is survival, feeding, and reproduction. It's not that exciting that you can reproduce. Go to the zoo. Check out the chimpanzees. They're doing wonderfully. Okay? Bravo, you could have a child. You know, like every species out there procreates. Like, you didn't. That should not be the most meaningful thing that ever happened to you. And that's a little being tough on the girls here, because women, can often be so linked to their fertility that it becomes more meaningful than life itself. But that's, again, this is what the message of Torah is that you got to have more meaning to life than the fact that you can procreate. Because just because you procreated means nothing. What means something is if your kids keep Torah. That means something. That you can create another generation of people who are connected to reality. That's meaningful. That you can create another generation is anatomy. It's biology. It's not meaningful. It's science. Science isn't meaningful in and of itself. So there's something about our testifying that God created the world is so beyond our comprehension. And how do we know it's so beyond our comprehension in its importance? I'm talking about its importance. That its importance, our testifying that God created the world, is so beyond our knowledge in its importance. How do we know that? How do we know that it's more important, way beyond our comprehension, that God created the world and rested on the seventh day? Why is that? How do we know that's way beyond our comprehension? I already gave the answer about 6 times. Yeah.
Because we don't understand why the death penalty.
Yeah, because it comes with a death penalty. Which you can never, as I said before, you can never mete it out. There would never be a death penalty. We would never allow for it. The way our laws work, you could never give a death penalty for it. So why is there a death penalty? To let you know that it's that all that stuff you don't understand about it is there. And by the way, you can learn it. It's amazing stuff. I mean, there's really some fabulous stuff that would make you literally never, ever, ever even have a test on whether to text on Shabbos. Like, it's not that far from you to learn this stuff. There's stuff you could learn in a matter of weeks that you'd never dream of breaking Shabbos, except in an absolute emergency where it's life and death or some other reason you're allowed to drive to a hospital or something. But like, when I meet people who are feel that test of Shabbos, like keeping Shabbos or not keeping Shabbos, I'm just meeting someone who just never studied. They just don't know. They don't realize. But it's enough for us to know if it came with a death penalty, that's not to scare you. It's just to let you know that there's depths of understanding that you're missing. And if you're still having a test about anything in Judaism, it's just a lack of knowledge. It's not because you're supposed to spend your life struggling over these things. You're not supposed to struggle over the things. You're supposed to actually know the Torah. It's your birthright to know the Torah. They think your birthright's to travel around Israel with a bunch of, young, libido crazy kids. The birthright is the knowledge of the Torah, is the birthright of the Jewish people. Shalom, everybody. Thank you for coming once again. Sorry if I was rough. Shalom. You can press finish.
It's on our